The wind shifted low through the canyon that night, and the flames crackled with the sound of memory. Eliza stood alone beside the fire, her silhouette carved against the orange glow that danced over the dry stones and broken porchwood. Her husband's chair, half-charred, leaned on 3 legs beside her, and the last log from the cedar stack he'd chopped 5 winters ago now hissed in the flames. There would be no more fuel after this, no more waiting, no more begging the land to be kind. This was her final night on the homestead. 10 Winters of drought had bled the soil dry. The chickens stopped laying. The goat wandered off. And when Jasper passed in the spring, the town had offered sympathy but no help. Pity came easy, but labor cost sweat, and no one wanted to trade either for a widow's sorrow. She had sold off her tools, her horse, her pride. What remained now was this old land and the memory of a man who once believed it could still bloom. Above, the sky stretched wide and cold. A few stars blinked, as if hesitant to look down. But further up the ridge, hidden by the mesquite, and still as a statue carved from night, sat a man atop a black horse. He wore a long coat stitched with bone buttons, and his braids were silver at the tips, catching moonlight like threads of fate. He said nothing, moved not an inch, but he watched Eliza's final fire as if it were a beacon long overdue. He had come here many times before, always from a distance, always in silence. No one in the valley knew his name anymore. The town remembered whispers, long ago, of a Lakota boy taken east, adopted into oil money and empire. When he returned as a man, he owned land, rail, and water. But he spoke rarely, gave even less, and never stayed long. Except on nights like this night, when someone's life flickered low and frontier redemption trembled on the edge of awakening. Eliza's fire popped, sparks danced upward like stubborn spirits refusing to die. She sat, pulling her shawl tight, eyes lost in flames, lips moving without sound. A prayer, or maybe a goodbye. There was no witness but the night and the man beyond the ridge. Then, in the stillness between breaths, something shifted. The fire dimmed low, and in its final glow, her husband's journal fell from a beam overhead, landing beside her boot. She reached down slowly, fingers trembling, and opened the cover. Inside, faded ink, whispered old plans, a hand-drawn map. Notes about hidden springs, seeds stored in jars, and a line scrawled near the end. If I fall, don't bury the dream, burn the past, and wait for the one who remembers. She looked around. No one was there, just the stars, the wind, and the ash that settled like snow across her shoulders. But up the hill, the horseman turned. By dawn, Eliza was gone. Not gone as in death, but gone as in vanished, like mist pulled back by the sun. Her fire was a circle of black soot, her chair, untouched, her boots, missing. But the journal lay open on the charred porch, and the wind had not turned a single page. It was as if the world itself held its breath. The town below didn't notice. They rarely did. The saloon opened at 7. The banker complained about cattle rates before his coffee even cooled. No one asked after the widow, not really. Some figured she'd taken the train east. Others assumed she'd finally gone mad and wandered into the canyon, swallowed by the dust. That land had always been cursed, they said. Nothing ever grew there but graves and grief. But on the high ridge, the man in the bone-button coat rode. Down slow, each hoofall sounded like judgment across the dry earth. He didn't tie the horse when he reached the homestead. He simply dismounted, stepped across the ashes, and picked up the journal without a word. His fingers, large and calloused, lingered on the page with the drawing of the spring and the faded message. Wait for the one who remembers. And he remembered. Long ago, before suits, shareholders, and steel cities, he had stood on this very soil, a boy no taller than the fence post, watching his mother tend herbs under a painted sky. Eliza and Jasper were already married back then, young and laughing. They had given his mother jars of honey and potatoes when the trading was lean. No one else had. And when the agents came with offers and papers and empty promises, it was Jasper who warned them first, who said, "Don't sign, they'll take your soul through the ink." But it hadn't mattered. The boy was sent away anyway. The land lost. The mother buried beneath unmarked ground. Now the boy had returned, as a man with money long enough to buy silence, but not enough to bury regret. He walked through the remains of the house, remembering the rafters she had carved. The bench still standing by the almond tree, which had somehow survived all the droughts. The jars buried beneath the floorboards intact, still full of heirloom seeds, like quiet promises. He gathered what the wind hadn't stolen. And when he returned to the town that afternoon, people turned. Not because they recognized him, but because he wore dust on his coat, fire ash on his sleeves, and a gaze that saw through them. He didn't stop at the bank. He didn't enter the mayor's office or the land registrar's desk. He walked straight to the post office and nailed a single sheet of paper to the bulletin wall. No signature, no letterhead, just 6 words, scrawled in sharp black ink. Land reclaimed. Do not trespass again. The room fell silent. Old-timers whispered. The sheriff blinked, and a cattleman near the door muttered, "Is it him?" But by the time anyone found their voices, the man was gone. Back to the ridge, back to the ashes, back to the seeds, and far beneath the dry ground. Something ancient began to stir, something deeper than water, older than maps. A memory of land once loved, a whisper of frontier redemption, awakening. 2 weeks passed. No one saw the man again. But changes crept into the town, like dawn creeping over frostbitten windows, slow, quiet, impossible to ignore once you noticed. The homestead once left for dead no longer looked like ruins. From the distance, its outline sharpened, as if something unseen was raising it from its knees. At first, it was the roof. Then the porch beams. The broken fence was mended in a single night, and by the 3rd week, rows of soil had been turned with such precision that even old ranchers stared in disbelief. No one admitted it out loud, but they rode out to the edge of the ridge, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost who labored alone. They never saw him work, yet the proof was in the earth. Crops began to sprout where only dust had lived. Water flowed faintly in the old trench beside the almond tree. And one dawn, a boy chasing a loose calf swore he saw a figure standing barefoot in the field, head bowed, hands covered in dirt, as if offering something invisible back to the land. Back in town, talk turned to rumor. The newspaper refused to publish the notice on the bulletin board. The sheriff asked who had authorized the land claim, but the bank, strangely quiet, received a letter sealed in wax, written in neat ink, that confirmed the deed had been purchased with full rights, and no room for contest. It had come from a holding company with a name that sparked a few old memories: Red Wind Equity. Few remembered that Red Wind had once been a Lakota phrase, whispered only during sacred gatherings. It meant, roughly, the voice that moves without being seen. It was him. Some wanted to fight it, others stayed away. But the curious and the hopeful, they began to drift closer. Eliza's cousin, Ruth, started walking up on Sundays. She brought 2 jugs of water and left them at the gate. A month later, the gate had been replaced with a carved arch of oak and iron. No one saw who built it. Then the animals returned. Not the old chickens or goats, but new ones, black-feathered hens that laid golden-shelled eggs. A mare with fire in her eyes, bees that nested in the rafters without fear. Birds no one had seen in years sang from the fence posts like praise songs rising from the land, and still, no voice came from the man himself. He did not visit the church, he did not dine at the inn. He did not ask for tribute or thanks. He let the soil speak, and the soil said something the town had long forgotten, that healing can arrive without announcement, that wealth isn't always in gold, but in giving the earth what it once lost. One morning, Ruth arrived to find a bundle on the gate. Fresh greens, corn, and a jar of honey. No tag, no note. Just one thing etched into the wood above, for what was once given freely. And though no one said it, everyone felt it. Frontier redemption had returned, not through law, not through force, but through honor, restored with hands and heart. By midsummer, the land had shifted. Not in a way you could measure with maps or weights, but in feeling, in breath, in the rhythm of things. The soil no longer crumbled like ash it clung to roots, rich and alive. The wind carried new scents, sun-warmed herbs, sweet tobacco, blossoms no one had planted. The old ones called it spirit scent, a sign that something ancient had stirred and approved. The town, once dismissive, now watched with uncertain awe. Horses paused at the edge of the rebuilt trail, sensing something sacred beyond. Children who once threw stones at the fence, now pressed wildflowers through its cracks. No one had spoken to the man, not yet, but the hush that surrounded him was heavier than presence. Then came the first real test. A land scout arrived from the east sent by a timber syndicate that still owned maps from a time when ink was more powerful than justice. He wore polished boots, mirrored glasses, and spoke like every word cost money. He claimed water rights, demanded proof of ownership, promised lawsuits if the redevelopment didn't cooperate. The townsfolk watched, unsure who to warn. The man on the ridge never came down. He didn't answer questions. He didn't explain, but the next morning the scout's fancy car was found parked sideways on the old road. Wheels stripped, mirrors cracked, and a note pinned to the hood. You are trespassing on breath and bone. This land remembers. He left before sunset. No one asked questions after that. Later that week, Ruth brought more water and found a surprise beside the old well. Dozens of clay pots, dug from the earth, glazed in tribal patterns that hadn't been seen in a century. Beneath one of them, carefully buried, was a rusted key and a folded cloth map that led not to treasure but to an underground spring. It had been Jasper's dream, a vision he once shared with Eliza on cold nights, that there was a secret source beneath the homestead, sealed long ago by those who came before, and forgotten in years of drought and war. He dug for it until his hands bled, then stopped when he grew ill. Eliza had prayed over that dream, tucked it into her bones, then laid it to rest beside the fire. And now, the silent man had found it. Or rather, the land had revealed it to him, because he wasn't just reclaiming soil, he was listening, honoring. Every shovel of earth he moved was guided not by greed, but memory. He was not building a ranch. He was restoring a covenant. And soon, people began to whisper a name that hadn't been spoken in town for decades. Less single quotes, Anne. It meant one who returns when the drum is silent. It was a name given only to those who rose from loss to carry the light of forgotten ancestors. Most believed such men were only myths. Until now, by the time the spring was opened and water ran freely again, even the oldest doubters stepped back in reverence. And across the land, flowers bloomed in cracks where nothing had grown since a first winter. Frontier redemption wasn't just waking, it was dreaming. And the dream had waited for him. When the spring broke open beneath the widow's land, it didn't roar like thunder. It whispered like a child returning home after a long journey. The water ran clean, smooth over rocks that had forgotten what it felt like to be wet. From the base of the almond tree, it trickled into hand-carved channels that glimmered beneath. Moonlight, winding through furrows already thick with green dot. No wells were dug. No pipes brought in, yet water found its way to every plant, every stone, every corner where death once nested. It was as if the earth, in remembering who walked upon it, had decided to give back what it had hidden. And in this silence, the town began to change. Ruth brought more than jugs. No, she brought cuttings, jars of seeds, and news. Others followed. The blacksmith's widow offered iron tools she hadn't touched in years. A ranch hand with a crooked leg limped up the trail just to place a handful of wild beans in the soil and say nothing. They didn't ask to speak with the man. They simply offered, then returned home different. By summer's end, the town noticed that no one had been arrested for weeks. The saloon fights quieted. The sheriff spent more time leaning on the post outside his office, just watching the hills. No laws had changed. But something had shifted deeper than ordinance. The land itself had become a witness again. And then came the boy. He arrived on the back of a freight cart, covered in soot and half-starved. No one knew his name, no one claimed him. He didn't speak, just wandered the edge of town, sleeping beside the church bell tower, staring at the hills, until one morning he disappeared. Ruth feared the worst. But days later, she climbed the ridge and found him barefoot, shirt torn, sitting beneath the almond tree. The man in the bone-button coat stood nearby, pouring water into a gourd, then handing it to the boy without a word. The child drank, then nodded once, and that's how the first helper arrived. From that day on, the boy never left. He worked the fields, fed the hens, even carved symbols into fence posts with the patience of a monk. Other children followed him like a compass. Some came from broken homes, some from far-off towns, but all of them, once they touched the soil, stayed. It became clear that this place was no longer just land. It was sanctuary. Redwind Equity had never filed for permits, never built a fence too high, but behind the curtain of silence, the land had turned into something sacred again. Not a farm, not a ranch, a remembering, and the man, Tal An, moved through it all like a ghost rooted in flesh. He spoke little, yet his presence echoed. He did not sign checks or take titles, but he held the ledger of the land in his hands and gave where the old world had taken. The town grew quiet with respect, not fear, not reverence, but understanding. They didn't ask what he was building. They simply started asking themselves what they had forgotten, and in the quiet. Redemption wasn't just a name on a deed, it became a rhythm in the water, a promise. In the leaves, a second chance planted deep. Autumn fell slowly across the valley, the way a mother might lower a quilt across her sleeping child. The fields ripened gold and rust, sunflowers bending heavy with seeds, and the sky carried a calm no one dared disturb. For the first time in years, the town breathed in rhythm with the land. They had stopped asking questions about the man. Stories. Did the speaking now that he was once a child torn from the soil? That he had returned not for vengeance, but for healing? That he had waited silently through decades of wealth, waiting not to build an empire, but to restore something holy. On the ridge, the almond tree bloomed again, unseasonal, impossible, and yet, white petals fell with every breeze like soft snowflakes whispering truths in a language older than stone. The children had begun calling the place the Circle, not a farm, not a school, but something in between. A place where knowledge didn't come from books alone, but from earth, wind, and water. They worked without being told, each child understanding their purpose by how the land greeted them. And in the center of it all stood a monument, none of them built, just a ring of stones left untouched from the widow's fire. No one had dared move them. Around it, they planted herbs, corn, tall grass, and beans in the exact shape Jasper once sketched in his journal. His dream had returned not as memory, but as inheritance. Then, one day, the man was gone. No one saw him leave. No tracks, no letters. Just his long coat folded over a chair beneath the almond tree, and beside it, a single eagle feather. But that afternoon, a red wind swept through the valley. The elders who remembered the old ways said nothing. They only stood outside their homes, eyes closed, lips moving in silent gratitude. The sheriff doffed his hat and faced the ridge. Ruth wept beside the fence, holding a basket of beans she no longer needed to deliver. At the post office, a final letter arrived. No envelope, no address, just a folded page slid under the door. It read, "Redemption does not end in return, it begins in memory. Let the land be the teacher. Let silence be the voice." The letter was pinned beside the deed. That night, beneath a sky so clear you could count the breadth of stars, the children lit a small fire in the circle. Not for warmth, not for loss, but to carry the spark forward. As flames flickered, one of the youngest whispered a line she had once heard Ruth speak. "From ashes we remember. In silence we grow." And far beyond the ridge, past the last rail line and the first snow, a horse galloped free beneath moonlight, its rider unseen, but never forgotten. Because when a widow lit her final fire, a silent Lakota billionaire watched, and from that moment, frontier redemption awakened.